Hi, I'm Althea Brooks. I'm Senior Director of Lifetime Learning in the University of Virginia's Office of Engagement. Today's program is part of Lifetime Learning's 2023 Spring Symposium, Building a New Nation, the Role of Four Virginia Presidents. You will learn from four knowledge experts giving lectures on April 12th and 18th, and all four of these distinguished faculty will assembled as a panel on April 19th. We hope you will tune in for each of these informative learning experiences. We have nearly 1,300, actually over 1,300 registered for this program from 44 states and 9 countries around the globe. Our moderator for this series is Pulitzer Prize winner Alan Taylor, the Thomas Jefferson Foundation Chair in the Cochran Department of History at UVA. We're fortunate to have Lindsay Chervinsky from George Washington University to speak with us today on the one and only George Washington, the Presidency and the Nation. She'll be introduced shortly. Should you have a question during this program, please share it in the Q&A box. Also, closed captioning is available should you need it at the bottom of your screen. Now, please help me welcome the longstanding faculty leader for our Summer Jefferson Symposium, John Ragasta. John is the interim Saunders Director at the Robert H. Smith International Center for Jefferson Studies at Monticello. John is a double who. He's taught at the University of Virginia, George Washington University, Hamilton, Oberlin, and Randolph colleges. He's a thought leader on Jefferson and Patrick Henry. John is the author of the following books: Wellspring of Liberty, How Virginia's Religious Dissenters Helped to Win the American Revolution and Secured Religious Liberty, published in 2010. Religious Freedom, Jefferson's Legacy, America's Creed, published in 2013. He's co-editor of The Founding of Thomas Jefferson's University, published in 2019. And John's latest book is due out in 2023, For the People, for the Country, Patrick Henry's Final Political Battle. John, thank you for coordinating our esteemed speakers for the Spring Symposium. Welcome. The microphone's all yours, John.
Thank you, Althea, and thank you all for joining us. We're really glad to have the chance to be with you today. I miss the opportunity to be in the same room with you and actually having that kind of back and forth. But as you can see, and as Althea pointed out, this type of program allows us to reach hundreds of people, which is really a great opportunity. Now, we're going to be talking over the course of 3 days about 4 Virginia presidents, 4 founders of the country who become presidents and have a great effect not only on the presidency, but in the process on the country itself. Now, as I started to think about this, it's very interesting because the presidency has changed a great deal. The presidency in the latter half of the 20th and 21st century is a much more powerful office, an office very fixated on foreign affairs. But I think we can still learn from these four presidents early in the nation's history. Thomas Jefferson is a great believer that studying history helps us to understand our era. Not that we can use the lessons directly. Jefferson would be the first to say each generation must govern for itself, but there are lessons to be learned in studying the history. And that's certainly true for these presidents. One of the other things that was very interesting to me as I started to think about these programs is especially for the first 3, for George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, and James Madison, they are remembered primarily for things outside of their presidency. And yet their presidency is enormously important. We're going to be hearing from 4 leading scholars. I suspect each of us is going to take a very different approach on how we analyze the presidency of one of these gentlemen and how they affect the nation. So we'll look forward to your questions. We'll look forward to your participation in this program. As always, we have great appreciation for Althea and for the folks at Lifetime Learning. They do a wonderful job. But now it's my pleasure to introduce our moderator for 3 days, and that's Alan Taylor. Alan Taylor is the Thomas Jefferson Foundation Chair in the Cochran Department of History at the University of Virginia. He has also taught at Boston University and the University of California, Davis. He is the author of 10 books. I will not mention all of them. We'll be taking too long to do so. I will mention two in particular. William Cooperstown, Power and Persuasion on the Frontier of the Early Republic, a winner of the Pulitzer Prize, Bancroft, and Beveridge Prizes, a trifecta of important historic awards, and his most recent book, American Republics, A Continental History of the United States, winner of the New York Historical Society's Barbara and David Zelaznik Book Prize in American History. Beyond being a great author, Alan, of course, is a very accomplished scholar and a teacher. He has been a faculty advisor for the California State Social Science and History Project. He has won the Phi Beta Kappa Northern California Association and the University of California Davis Awards for teaching. And he is a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and the American Philosophical Society. Alan, we're looking forward to your moderation. Thank you.
Well, thank you, John, for that very kind introduction. And I also want to echo your thanks to Althea and to other members of her team, Ashley, Dana, Tricia. It's always a pleasure to work with Lifetime Learning at UVA. And I'm especially excited about this program. As John mentioned, we have a great group of scholars who are very interested in having a public conversation about the relevance of these founding presidents in our own time. It's a special pleasure for me to introduce Lindsay Chervinsky because I had the good pleasure and honor of working with her when she was a graduate student at UC Davis when we were both there. And Lindsay has had a very successful launch to her career. She's currently a senior fellow. She looks much too young to be a senior fellow at the Center for Presidential History at Southern Methodist University. She's also a professorial lecturer at the School of Media and Public Affairs at George Washington University. Her first book, an award-winning book, which emerged out of her dissertation, is entitled The Cabinet, George Washington and the Creation of American Institution. And it really is a remarkable work of interpretation and research. She is the co-editor of another book entitled Mourning the Presidents, Loss and Legacy in American Culture. And she's currently working on a forthcoming book on John Adams, who we've left out of this program because he's not from Virginia. Chervinsky regularly writes for broader readerships in the Wall Street Journal, Ms. Magazine, The Daily Beast, The Bulwark, Time Magazine, USA Today, for CNN, NBC Think, and The Washington Post. So I'm very much looking forward to what Lindsay has to say. And I just also want to thank all of you who have registered for this program and will be joining us today. Lindsay?
Well, thank you, Alan, for that very kind introduction. I really appreciate it. And it's really fun to be on this program with you. I think this is the first time we've done this since I got my PhD. So that's a little bit of a hoot. I want to thank you all so much for being here. And I also want to apologize. I have a terrible cold, and I am going to do my very best to not cough in your ears. But if that does happen, I do apologize. And thankfully, one of the benefits of Zoom is that we're not in person, and so I will not give you my cold. I'm going to talk for about 40 minutes, maybe a little less, on George Washington, his presidency, and the role of building a new nation. But I am really eager to save time for questions because that's actually always my favorite part of this process. I want to know what you want to know more about, and I want to give you that information. So please feel free to put your questions in the Q&A box down below. I won't see them while I'm talking, so they won't distract me. So feel free to put them in as I am going along. So whenever we talk about George Washington and his contribution to the creation of the nation, it's really difficult to explain his role in the imagination, the public imagination of his contemporaries without sounding like we're being hyperbolic or exaggerating or, fawning a little bit too much. And so I'm going to, a couple moments, sort of stop and acknowledge that some of the times that language sounds a little ridiculous and explain why I'm using it. So there are three elements that I think we should really focus on for Washington's legacy as part of his role in creating this new nation. So the first is his role as a figurehead. The second is his role crafting the executive branch. And finally, there is that legacy piece, what he left behind for those that followed. One of the things that is so important about Washington's contribution to building the nation was his very existence, the act of showing up, which often is sort of discounted because it's really hard to measure, it's hard to quantify. It's not as sexy as winning a Civil War or World War II or solving the Great Depression, but he showed up time and time again when his presence was desperately needed. And the first time that this really came up was during the Revolutionary War. There were a few figures that had military experience that were born in the United States that came from one of the really big important states like Virginia. And so Washington was a natural choice for the commander-in-chief of the Continental Army. And very quickly into the war, Congress realized how indispensable he was, in that they literally could not replace him, even if they wanted to, because the troops and most of the officer corps were so desperately loyal to Washington that Congress took to calling the army Washington's army or Washington's troops, because they knew that if he left or something happened to him or he was replaced, the army would disintegrate. And one of the great pleasures of digging into the primary sources of this period is to look at the letters and the diaries of troops and soldiers and the language they use to describe Washington, to describe his leadership, their interactions with him, would really make us uncomfortable today because they just adored him. They worshiped him. And anytime they even saw him, it was so worthwhile to mention in their letters home to the family. So it wasn't even necessarily that he made great choices all the time. Lord knows he did not. He lost more than he won. But it was that he was with the army. He never went home. The only time he was at Mount Vernon during the war were a couple of days on the march down to Yorktown. He stayed with his troops during really difficult winters. He sacrificed, and he was very concerned with their conditions, their pay, and they paid back that loyalty in spades and just worshipped him. And so again, here his presence was just essential, not even so much what he did, but the fact that he showed up every day and never left. After Washington, of course, famously returned his commission to Congress after the end of the war, his reputation was vaunted, and it just became such a celebrated figure across the globe. At this point, Americans were already speaking of him as the father of the country. He was celebrated in European nations for returning power. And while Napoleon wasn't yet on the scene, this is really the age of Napoleon. So it's the age of the military dictator. And so his actions were indeed remarkable, and they caused Americans to have trust for him in a way that they had trust for few politicians and few other people. So by 1787, when it was clear that the Articles of Confederation had failed to address the economic crisis facing the nation, the tensions between the states, and the diplomatic and defense needs of the new country, the states, 12 out of the 13 states sent representatives to Philadelphia for a constitutional convention. Virginia sent a list of delegates that would be attending, and Governor Edmund Randolph, who was one of Washington's very close friends, included Washington's name on the list, obviously. Washington declined. He said he had very publicly announced his retirement. He was going to have no participation. And Randolph conveniently forgot to tell the legislature that Washington had said no. And by the time he did tell the legislature, it was too late to name a replacement. And that gap in time, that delay, was essential in allowing James Madison, Randolph's ally, Edmund Randolph himself, Henry Knox, other people who were close to Washington, to convince him that if he did not go to the Constitutional Convention, it would not work. And the only way it would work was if he was present, because his attendance, his participation was essential to give it this symbolic value to make a product that the American people would accept and would ratify. Washington finally did agree to go. He was immediately elected the president of the convention, and he was there for every single session. He didn't miss a single day of work. As you can see in the bottom picture here, when he wasn't sitting with the Virginia delegation, he was often sitting at the dais at the front of the room as the president of the convention. And it must have been pretty awkward to be discussing the presidency, to be discussing limitations on executive power, or various ways in which presidents might act wrongly with Washington sitting there staring at you. So he definitely left his mark on the convention. He didn't say much, but he voted with the Virginia delegation. He was there staring at all of the delegates. And then at the very end in September, once the delegates had signed the Constitution, or the draft Constitution, he wrote a cover letter and signed it himself and sent it to Congress and to the states. And in doing so, he was essentially giving a recommendation for this document, and it carried an enormous weight because of his unparalleled stature and the trust that American people had in him. Once the Constitution was ratified, there was going to need to be an election for the president. And here's where some of that language becomes kind of weird for us. Washington was the only person that could be the first president, because he was the only person that had the national reputation. During the war, he had gone up and down the various states. He had been seen by more of the American people. They trusted him to handle this enormous amount of responsibility and power at a time when Americans were still very distrusting of executive authority, because it seemed an awful lot like the monarchy that they had just fought a war against. And he was the only person that could bring the states together. So Benjamin Franklin, I think, was probably equally well known, but he was very old. And in fact, he died during Washington's first year in office. So he was never a serious contender. And everyone else had regional support, but didn't have a way to bring together the new states. Now, today, when we have a national crisis, when we're going through a difficult period of time, we lean on a couple of different things that give us comfort, that can boost our morale, that can help us get through that moment. Maybe it's the American flag, maybe it's the Constitution, maybe it's our shared national history. None of those things really existed, or at least they didn't exist in the popular imagination in the same way. The Constitution was not yet this celebrated document. The nation had a very short history. The flag existed, but it didn't have, again, the same symbolism. And the states didn't really have any ties to one another. Famously, Jefferson would say that he was a Virginian first, and then he was an American. And that was a very common sentiment, that your state was your nation. And so Washington was the person that people had emotional connection to. He was the thing that could hold this new experiment together. So he took his oath of office on April 30th, 1789. He became the first president of the United States. And on his way to New York City for that inauguration, he said to Henry Knox that he felt as though he was a prisoner heading to the place of execution, because, which of course, not exactly the usual inauguration sentiment, but because he knew how much pressure was riding on his shoulders, and one misstep could cause the entire thing to fall apart. The reason he thought that one misstep could cause the entire thing to fall apart was because the nation was on its second chance. The Constitution was the second go-round, and most nations, especially most republics, don't get second chances. They either devolve into a civil war or anarchy or a military dictatorship. And Americans were great students of history, which of course we applaud. And they knew this about American history, or global history, and they knew that republics could go badly very quickly. So Washington was very cautious about every single decision he made, every single precedent he established, knowing that it would guide those that followed him, worrying that it would cause one wrong choice would cause the experiment to fail. And also with the keen awareness of just how much actually had to be decided. So I encourage everyone, when you have a moment, to look at Article 2 of the Constitution. It is incredibly short. There are very few words written down, and even less is written down about how the president is supposed to act. There's some about powers, but how the president is supposed to comport himself, and hopefully someday herself, interact with the other branches of government, lead in moments of crisis. These are all things that had to be fleshed out, and Washington was the first person to do so. One of the things that he realized about the executive and the presidency in particular is it wasn't just a series of leadership decisions, it was a social role. There was a social element of engaging with other Americans, engaging with foreign representatives, being the nation's representative on the world stage. And those social elements had to be crafted and were really a contested practice because everyone had different opinions about what was the right way for a president to act. And I would argue that this is something that we are very much still grappling with today. So what Washington did was he came up with a series of ways that he could try and instill respect and prestige and sort of respectability in the presidency, but be accessible to the Americans as well. So the first thing he did at the president's house in New York and then the president's house in Philadelphia, which is pictured here. Unfortunately, the president's house no longer exists. So this is a 3D creation that I've done that shows you a little bit what the house would have looked like. At the president's house on Tuesday afternoons, Washington held levees, which were basically gatherings in which any man with a good set of clothes, which really meant any white man with a good set of clothes, could come, be introduced to the president, exchange a few words, and then leave. So weren't necessarily great bonding conversations, but was access. It was a way for men to actually meet the president. So it was a little bit more accessible than the monarchy that people were familiar with. On Friday afternoons, Martha Washington held her drawing rooms, which this is a depiction of, but I think that they would have been a little bit less formal than this because generally lemonade was served, no alcohol was served because Martha was very virtuous about these events. And they were essential socializing activities that allowed the networking and the behind the scenes politicking that were required for the new nation to take place. Because women were present, these were not considered to be political events. They were sort of semi-private, semi-public events. And so Washington was not there as the president. He was there as her husband and as a private citizen. This is obviously not a distinction we would draw today. Women are indeed capable of discussing politics. And when they are present, when the president is present, he is still the president, even if women are present. But that was a social convention at the time, and Washington took full advantage of this. He would go up to senators and share his opinion on bills or legislature or proposals, and they would often take that information back and implement it. And it wasn't considered inappropriate interference because it was at these private events. So Martha really crafted a space in which Washington was able to do this really important political work. They also hosted state dinners every Thursday evening. Usually these were attended by cabinet secretaries and their wives, Supreme Court justices and their wives, foreign dignitaries or envoys that came to meet with the United States, congressmen, and then elite families in Philadelphia. These were by invitation only, and Washington was quite attentive to make sure that each congressional delegation by each state was represented equally. So they were private events, but they were very much politically motivated. Washington also had to sort of grapple with how to present himself as president. This is something that we continue to discuss. What is the right color suit for a president to wear? How should they travel? How much should they go on vacation? These are all things that we still debate today. And so Washington tried to find this balance. Now, on one hand, he had the fanciest coach in all of North America. This is a similar version, but his would have been cream colored with gold trim. And anyone who has a white car know what happens when you take your white car out and it rains. So the cream colored coach with gold trim was a statement that he had enough wealth to either hire or to own the labor required to clean that cream coach every time he took it out. And this is in an age before running water, before sewage, before pavement. So it was quite a statement. It was very recognizable. Now, on the other hand, Washington also took a walk every afternoon, and he would walk to the town square and adjust his timepiece to the town clock. And this was a statement that was very much recognized by his contemporaries as a statement that he was no better than anyone else. He was just the same. His boots got dirty like every other citizen, and he was just like every other American who happened to be in New York and then Philadelphia. That might not be something we would pick up on, but they definitely did, and they appreciated the message that he was trying to convey. Similarly, Washington As a side note, Washington was the creator of the American foxhound. I have an American foxhound, not because Washington created it. It was a rescue and it was a benefit. And I can tell you that they are quite loud. So if the mailman comes, I'm just giving you an authentic Washington historic experience. Until that time, yeah. Anyway, I'm going to try and talk over my dog, but so apologies. Age of Zoom challenges. Washington was very much a man of the people. He tried to present himself in that particular way. So he was the first to wear American made for his inauguration. He was determined to try and make sure that whatever he wore had been crafted in the United States. So he refused to wear French silk or British wool, and he instead ordered an American homespun suit, which was probably a dark brown. This might be the version of it, but it's not totally clear if the provenance of this suit was actually the one that he wore on that particular day. So it was homespun. And but you know, he was intentional about wanting to make sure that the finery was balanced. So in addition to the American homespun, he also had diamond shoe buckles. Washington also wanted to make sure that the people around him were able to see him if they weren't in Philadelphia. So in his first year in office, Washington took a northern tour and he went to all of the states except Rhode Island, because Rhode Island had not yet ratified the Constitution, and Washington could be very petty like that. Once they ratified, he did in fact go back and visit. And so you can see on the map on the left, that was his northern tour. The following year, he did a southern tour and he went south. He would go south on the eastern side of the state and then come up the western side of the state. And every place that he stopped, he was determined to make sure he could see whatever crops were produced, whatever trade was produced. He wanted to see how people were living in those states, what they were contributing to the nation's success, and what sort of lifestyle they lived. And so this was really important to Washington, to be able to go all over the country to see the American people and to bring the presidency to them for the first time. This was at an age when the federal government didn't really have its fingers in daily life of the American people. And so Washington wanted to make sure the presidency and the federal government was visible to all Americans. So the second element of Washington's tenure was his attempt to craft the presidency. And this has so many different elements, in addition to sort of the daily practices of what it meant to write letters, to govern, to make choices. He had to figure out how to interact with the other branches of government and what that would look like. Sorry, this is very distracting and I apologize. So the first element that Washington had to figure out was a part of Article 2. And Article 2 says that the president, with the advice and consent of the Senate, will make treaties and foreign appointments. The delegates at the Constitutional Convention were very specific that advice and consent part was important. They really wanted the Senate to actually be giving advice. And so when Washington took office, he fully intended for the Senate to serve as an advisory body for any decisions on foreign policy, for any decisions on treaties. And so when he took office, one of the very first things that he had to do was to send a peace commission to meet with Native nations, representatives from Native nations, as well as representatives from North and South Carolina. This was something he hadn't done before. He didn't know really what the instructions should say, and so he wanted the Senate's input. So he sent a letter to the Senate and said that he planned to come visit with them. He wanted to get their advice. He sent them all of the pre-existing treaties so that they would have a sense of what information was available. And he actually met with a committee to plan out some of the details like where he would sit, where John Adams, the president of the Senate and the vice president, would sit when Washington was present, how he would be introduced, all of the small things that maybe seem unimportant until you have to make all of those decisions for the first time. On the day of the appointed visit in August of 1789, Washington arrived. He brought with him the acting Secretary of War, Henry Knox, to answer any questions, to be able to provide any more information, because Knox had overseen the existing treaties that were on the books. Washington also brought a list of questions for the Senate to debate, to discuss, to provide input and advice on. And when he got there, he read that list of questions, and the Senate sat in silence. Some of the senators sort of twiddled their thumbs or fiddled with papers or avoided eye contact. These are all strategies that I will tell you students still use today to avoid being called on. And they work about as well as they worked for the senators in August of 1789. After a few minutes, one of the senators, Senator William Maclay of Pennsylvania, stood up and said that this issue was new to them and they hadn't had time to study it. And could Washington come back the following week for their advice, for their suggestions? Washington stood up and he absolutely lost it. He yelled, "This defeats every purpose of my being here," except much larger and taller and bigger and scarier, because this was, again, like the most famous person in the world yelling at them. Washington did finally regain his composure. He got a hold on his temper and he agreed to come back the following week. But on his way out, he reportedly said that he would never again return for advice. And the evidence about whether or not he said that is a little sketchy, but he never again returned for advice. So he was definitely thinking it. So just a couple of months into Washington's presidency, this key element of Article 2, this important advisory body that the delegates at the Constitutional Convention had crafted to serve as a council on foreign affairs for the president, Washington had determined was too inefficient, was not going to work for the demands of the presidency, for the demands on foreign policy. He needed advisors that could be snappy, who could make a decision quickly and provide the sort of input he wanted. So this visit immediately crafts the executive branch in a particular way and sets up a wall between the Senate and the executive that maybe wasn't anticipated or intended. A couple of other key moments where Washington took decisive action to carve out jurisdiction for the presidency or to increase executive power occurred in 1793 and 1794, respectfully, yes. In 1793, France declared war on Great Britain, and the conflict quickly spiraled into a international war that encompassed the colonies and the allies and enemies of France and Great Britain. And the United States was tasked with trying to stay out of it, which is actually way more complicated than it sounds. Because Washington did issue a proclamation of neutrality, which you can see here on the left. But there were all of these questions that came up, like, what would you do if Americans didn't respect that proclamation? What law were they breaking? What court was supposed to hear that case? Who was supposed to enforce any sort of punishment? These were just a couple of the questions, and they were the domestic questions. The international questions were even more complex because neutrality can be quite fuzzy. And it was made much more complicated by the French foreign minister, Citizen Edmond Charles Genet, who arrived and had a very different interpretation of what he thought American neutrality should look like. And he set up basically a shop for privateers, which were private ships sailing under a license, or what they called a letter of marque, from a foreign nation. So for example, France would hire a bunch of these private ships to go attack British ships. Whenever they were successful and they captured a British ship, they would drag it back into port, sell off anything valuable, and then turn that British ship into another French privateer. And this was very common war practice in the 18th century and actually up until the Civil War. Anyone who was fighting the war did this, including the United States. But It became incredibly complicated when Genet's privateers, these French privateers, were super successful and were dragging British ships back into the port of Philadelphia, just 6 blocks from the president's house, and were obviously sort of testing this neutral theory, which did not go unnoticed by the British minister who was also in Philadelphia. So Washington had a couple of options. He could have convened an emergency session of Congress, because Congress had a tendency at this point to be out of session when anything interesting happened. He could have waited for Congress to come back into session in the fall, or he could sort of establish foreign policy by himself. And in 1793, he met with the cabinet 51 times, which was the high watermark of cabinet activity during his presidency, to craft a series of rules that would govern neutral behavior. And those rules were ultimately codified by Congress into law. And that law actually established American neutrality policy all the way up through the Civil War. So in doing so, Washington basically determined that the presidency was going to be the sole actor in foreign policy, and Congress would kind of just follow its example. Now, the Senate, of course, still had to ratify treaties, but when a treaty is not required, Washington basically decided that Congress moves too slowly to have a role and is too annoying to have to call back into session. And so the executive branch would craft policy, would enforce that policy, and then Congress would kind of go along. The following year, Washington had a slightly different test, which was that of domestic policy. In 1794, protests over a whiskey excise tax, which had been passed a couple of years previous, turned violent when the protesters burned down the home of a tax collector, and one of the protesters were killed when the two sides exchanged fire. Washington, again, had a couple of options. He could leave it to the states to handle. Could in theory be a Pennsylvania problem. He could, again, convene an emergency session of Congress because Congress was still out of session. He could wait until Congress came back later in the fall, or he could use a loophole in a previously passed law that said that in the event of foreign invasion or domestic rebellion, the president could call up local militias if evidence was significant enough that it required a military force. So he presented these options to the cabinet, and the cabinet immediately agreed that he should use that final option after he had sent a peace commission to try and make sure that they had used all non-violent options. Peace commission failed, and that fall, Washington called up the militias from Pennsylvania, New York, New Jersey, and Maryland, and they marched out to meet the protesters. The protest immediately fell apart, and a bunch of the protesters were rounded up and were arrested, and some were charged. Washington actually ended up pardoning all of the protesters, including those that had been sentenced to death, because it was much less about the punishment than it was the principle that the United States government has the right to pass tax policy and enforce it. And when Congress came back into session after all of this had happened, they didn't really say much. The Republicans kind of rumbled to themselves that, Washington had made it a political thing, but they didn't push back on his action. They didn't push back on his decisive decision to call up the militia. And in doing so, again, Washington carved out this jurisdiction for executive power and carved out this space for the president to be a decisive force over domestic policy, when maybe the Constitution should suggest it should either be Congress or the states. One of, I think, the most interesting and perhaps one of the most relevant moments also came towards the end of Washington's presidency, when he established and asserted executive privilege for the first time. So in 1794, Chief Justice John Jay went to Great Britain to negotiate a treaty that sort of reestablished the trade parameters between the two nations. It was very unpopular, especially in the South. And when it came time for the Senate to ratify it, they did, but then it had to go to the House of Representatives so that the House could pass funds to comply with all the terms of the treaty. And Republicans, and I should mention that this is either Jeffersonian Republicans or Democratic Republicans, or they called themselves Republicans. So that's the word that I tend to use, saw this as an opportunity to scuttle the treaty. And so they requested all of the executive branch papers that pertained to the negotiations, thinking maybe it would embarrass the administration and therefore would sort of ruin this treaty. And so they requested Washington turn over these papers, and he sent a response back, and they're going to, the lovely team is going to drop the link to this letter into the chat for you all to read, because I think it's one of Washington's best letters. He says no. He reminds them that in the past he has complied with these requests, so he believes in the congressional right to oversight. But in this case, diplomacy, or what we might think of today as national security, requires an additional level of secrecy and privacy so that foreign nations feel like they can talk in good faith with American representatives. And so he says, no, I'm not going to do it. He says, however, if this were an impeachment proceeding, that would be a higher level of oversight, and I would comply. So he's doing two very interesting things there. He's both drawing a distinction between regular congressional oversight and an impeachment proceeding. And he's also kind of daring them to impeach him, which they're obviously not going to do. So it is very much a dare that he knows they're not willing to test. And then he kind of drops the mic, has this ultimate gauntlet moment where he says, I was at the Constitutional Convention. I was there when we decided what branches were going to have a role in the foreign policy process. And the House of Representatives has no role. And you are trying to usurp more power than the Constitution grants to you. And if you would like to challenge my recollection, I have the journals from the Constitutional Convention sitting in the Department of State offices, and I would be happy to share them with you. It is so spectacularly snarky in a way that Washington is not usually snarky. So I highly recommend checking out the letter. It's one of my favorites. Finally, Washington created the cabinet, which, as you can see from my pillow and the cover, which is the cover of the book that I wrote on the cabinet, I think is a really important subject. Every president since Washington has had a cabinet, and it's because he created it in the way that he created it. So Article 2, in addition to that part about the foreign policy process and the treaty-making process in which the Senate is supposed to play a role, it also says that the president may request written advice from the department secretaries. And this clause is very carefully crafted because it's supposed to be written so that there is a record of who says what, so that there is transparency at the highest levels of the executive branch, and so that people know who to hold responsible for good or bad decisions. And it was crafted in a direct response to Americans' conviction that the British cabinet was to blame for corrupting King George III against them. The British cabinet was everything that was wrong with the government. And so this clause was designed to push back against that. Washington initially tried to do that. He did exchange letters with the department secretaries, but he quickly found that the process of writing back and forth with parchment and quill, and then, waiting for it to dry and waiting for the letter to be delivered, and then what happens if you have follow-up questions, was just way too cumbersome and required face-to-face conversation. So for the first 2.5 years, Washington invited the department secretaries to one-on-one consultations in his office. Usually they would exchange a letter first, so there was a record about who said what, and then they would come and they would meet with the president in his private study and sort of hammer out all of the details and then sort of move forward with a new draft. And that worked for the first 2.5 years. So again, I emphasize that date because the cabinet was not preordained. It was not destiny. It was not guaranteed to exist, and it did not exist from day one. It was very much a creation that Washington turned to out of necessity when he realized that some issues, like the treaties and the economic relationships with Spain, Great Britain, and France, which was the subject of the first cabinet meeting, were simply too large for one person to advise on. He needed multiple points of view. And when he did start to pull together cabinet meetings, he always did so in this private study. So it was a private, very personal advisory body. It was designed to be something that helped Washington when it worked for him. And when he didn't want to talk to them, he didn't convene the cabinet meeting. And so later in his presidency, I mentioned that in 1793, he met with the cabinet 51 times. later in his presidency, when he had some new cabinet secretaries, not the big names of Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson and Henry Knox, he didn't really like the replacements all that much. I affectionately call them the B team, and he thought less of their abilities and their advice. And so he didn't meet with them all that much. And in doing so, Washington crafted this precedent that the cabinet is designed to work for the president however he or she sees fit. If the president wants to meet with the cabinet every day, great, they can do that. If the president wants to have advisors that are outside of the cabinet, that are former colleagues, that are on now the National Security Council, that are family or friends, they are empowered to do so. And so sometimes that flexibility is great and does amazing things. FDR and Lincoln took that flexibility and did phenomenal things with their administration. Other times, not so much. So I encourage, when you go to the Madison lecture in a couple of days, ask about the cabinet. The cabinet flexibility didn't work so great for Madison. So in terms of Washington's legacy, I think few presidents have had a legacy that has lasted longer or had more impact than Washington. And I think there are three particular reasons why, and in three particular ways. So first, the presidency. This obviously doesn't have our current president, sort of an old picture. But as I mentioned, every single president since Washington has had a cabinet. It's because of him. He has shaped the contours of the office. So presidents have to think about how they're going to interact with Americans, how they are going to host social events, how they are going to speak to various citizens, how they're going to represent the nation on the world stage. And these are all things that Washington either also had to grapple with or tried to finesse some of the details that were not written down in the Constitution. Washington also left office again. He resigned after 2 terms. He refused to run for a third, even though I think he would have been elected again. And he did so for a couple of reasons. One, he was very tired of the presidency. We obviously don't have photographs, but I have no doubt that he would have shown the similar age progression that we do see when presidents are able to be photographed from the start of the term until the end. He was very tired of the criticism and the increasing partisan rancor that came to define the political world at the end of his term. But he also believed it was essential that the process of election, the process of picking a president when it wasn't him, had to happen while he was still alive. It had to be intentional. So he couldn't die in office and have someone, whether it was John Adams or a future vice president, come into power. He needed the country to start to learn how to elect someone, how to have a transition, how to have a peaceful transfer of power at a time when that was not something that was done. That was not a standard practice. That was not an expected outcome. And he needed to be around in order to sort of, again, give his stamp of approval, to give that symbolic oversight over that process. And I think that that really can't be. We often talk about the farewell address as this extraordinary thing, and the fact that he leaves is extraordinary. But the fact that he does so, I think, and why he does so is almost more important. And finally, of course, we cannot talk about his legacy without talking about the legacy of slavery. So Washington very much affected the first several presidents by his use of slavery in the president's house. He brought enslaved individuals from Mount Vernon to first New York and then Philadelphia. While there, he worked with Edmund Randolph, who was the Attorney General, to cycle them out of Pennsylvania so they would not be automatically manumitted. But there was also a real impact on what hospitality and living at the president's house looked like. So he had enslaved individuals to, of course, take care of every single need in the house, to cater to people who were present, who were visiting, and he didn't have to pay for that labor. And so what that meant for people that followed him is that there was an expectation that the president would have enslaved labor and not have to pay for it out of their salary. So for presidents like John Adams and John Quincy Adams, when they didn't own people, they had to figure out how to pay for that labor. And it was a significant cost at a time when they didn't have the same sort of wealth that Washington did. And I think that pernicious expectation that the president will be someone of extraordinary wealth, whether it's in money or in human bondage, is one that we're still sort of grappling with today. Washington, of course, owned hundreds of people. Some he owned outright, and some were through the dowager estate of Martha Washington. So it was a daily part of his life. The coach that we talked about were tended to, were cared for, and were manned by enslaved individuals with matching uniforms that Washington designed. When he went back to Mount Vernon, there was both the enslaved population in the house and those that actually ran the plantation that made his wealth possible. So slavery was very much a part of his life, for better, for in every single element, whether it was how Washington was trying to grapple with this thing that he saw and he knew was bad, or just how he went about living his daily existence. And it's, of course, captured in the two pictures on the right, the two portraits of the Washington family and Washington as a commander-in-chief. He had enslaved individuals near him at all times. Now, where Washington does sort of differ from some of the other Virginians that we're going to talk about is he, of course, famously freed the individuals that he owned upon the death of Martha, and she did emancipate them earlier. Why is sort of a tricky question. And this decision should be both, I think, applauded and also questioned. And the reason I say that is because not too many other people did that. And so that is something. It's not enough, but it's something. He put his estate in such a way that it was able to fund that emancipation. Thomas Jefferson, of course, was in roughly $2 million of debt. And so the enslaved population at Monticello had to be auctioned off to pay those debts. Where I think Washington needs to be questioned is he knew it was wrong long before then. He started to have a real conversion on slavery, especially during the Revolution, when he saw the valor and the bravery with which African-American troops fought. He started to question it over the next several years. He made these plans, but he made the plans for when he died. So he continued to benefit from the labor and the improvements they brought to his life for as long as he existed. So this is, I think, an important part of the legacy that we're still grappling with and we still have to continue to think about. And I look forward to talking about it a little bit more. I'm now eager to get to some of your questions, so I'm going to stop sharing my screen and invite Alan to come back, and we will see how many questions we can get through.
We have many excellent questions, some sent before the session even began, and then many during the session. So you provoked a lot of very thoughtful questions. One, I wonder if to begin with, you mentioned at the start that we usually speak about Washington in terms of superlatives, and you've worked in along the way, certainly plenty of evidence for those superlatives, but also some examples where he's less than perfect. So I'm wondering what is on balance your assessment of Washington?
Yeah, I'm glad we're starting here because this is actually the most common question I get whenever I talk about him, because people acknowledge the monumental role that he played, but also the real challenge of how do you respect and celebrate someone who owned people and bought people when he was younger and continued to pursue those who ran away and all of these things. He could also sometimes be a jerk to white people too. So he's not, like uniformly great. He's certainly not fuzzy and cuddly. And I think what we have to do is we have to acknowledge that we're not talking about a spreadsheet. So we don't have like the pros in one column and the cons in one column, and we're not trying to balance them out and make sure that we can, balance our checkbook. We are very much talking about a complex human, and we should tell the full story, which includes his essential role to the nation's founding and his sort of unparalleled stature and the contribution and sacrifice and leadership that went with those things, as well as the areas where he could have done a lot more and had real moral failing and cruelty. And both of those things are true and they don't cancel each other out. And we shouldn't try and cancel them out. So we can both have respect and tell the full story. And it doesn't mean that the other doesn't exist.
Thank you. Could you say something about how John Adams carried forward the precedents set by Washington, particularly in modeling the cabinet?
So John Adams had a really crap job, because everyone knew that whoever followed Washington was going to have a terrible time. They were going to come up short in comparisons. They were not going to fare very well in reputation. They were going to be the first president that really has to deal with real elections and partisan politics. John Adams knew it. George Washington knew it. Thomas Jefferson knew it. Thomas Jefferson was delighted that he was not elected in 1796 because he did not want to deal with that situation. And so John Adams was dealing with this situation in which he was trying to provide some continuity and trying to provide stability at a time when Americans genuinely weren't sure if the presidency worked without Washington. They didn't know if any of this was going to, was it even possible? So he was trying to provide some continuity, and still try to be his own man without, spooking anybody or without appearing to cast judgment on Washington's decisions. So one of the worst choices Adams made, and he knew this later, but one of the worst choices he made was to retain Washington's B team as his cabinet. And it was a disaster because Timothy Pickering, who was the Secretary of State, thought he was smarter than anyone in the room. And he was in the room with a lot of pretty smart guys. Most of the other cabinet members were deeply loyal to Alexander Hamilton. And from the very beginning, they didn't really follow Adams' directions or orders, and they kind of tried to undermine his foreign policy, and it was a total mess. And in doing so, it set up this, I think, very essential rule of cabinet leadership, which is you never really keep the cabinet of your predecessor. And Jefferson was very keen to do that and very much made his own cabinet that suited his leadership style.
Thank you. How did Washington's style of addressing Congress differ from, say, how modern presidents do so?
So I did some research before the President's State of the Union this year. I went back and I compared all of Washington's addresses to Congress with some of those that followed and some of the more recent ones. And, one of the things that I think is interesting is Washington really applauded brevity. And I think partly that's because for him, it was difficult to talk. He had dentures and it was uncomfortable. So I think his first one was 827 words. Which is roughly 10 minutes. So clearly modern presidents have not embraced that length. But a lot of the themes that Washington harped on are themes that we still hear today. So investing in education and infrastructure and civic engagement, the importance of funding the military and military innovation, especially the Navy, the importance of paying off our debts and having a strong national economy. They all end with some sort of appeal to a higher power. It's not usually God bless America, but they all appeal to a higher power. So I think that there are some really interesting through lines through all of the different addresses to Congress that demonstrate that the issues we are still facing today, in a lot of ways, were the same issues they were facing then. They just didn't necessarily have internet or electricity.
Thank you. Now, Washington was a military man, and then he becomes president of the United States, and finding the boundary line between what is appropriate for the military to do and what is appropriate for a president to do in a civil context is one of the precedents he had to set. Can you say something about his military experience and then about how he defined the role of the military in his presidency?
Absolutely. I think this is a really important precedent and one we continue to sort of struggle with because we often, as a republic, are not totally sure what's the right line for military participation in politics, and it gets fuzzy sometimes. So as Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army, Washington was determined to show respect and subservience to civilian authority, even when it drove him bananas, because Congress could be quite inept. But he was determined to convey that congressional and civilian authority did oversee his ruling of the Continental Army. And so he went out of his way to be respectful, to go visit Congress when they called upon him, to invite them to camp. And he established this practice. And he continued it as president. And it led to some pretty funny moments. For example, I mentioned that northern tour to the northern states. At one point, a group of militia outside of Boston said that they wanted to do sort of a military parade and a series of military exercises for him. And he said, no. He said, I will basically march by, I can see you, but I'm not going to review your military exercises because it would be inappropriate. I am a civilian leader, I am a president, and we are not at war. And so it would not be right for me to engage in these sorts of military practices. And so I think that starts to sort of craft this expectation that there is this separation between the presidency and the military, and there should be, especially at times of peace. And so that was something that he was very careful to craft as president. I should say, as a bit of a spoiler alert for the book that I'm working on now, he undermines that pretty significantly in his post-presidential life. But hopefully I'll have the opportunity to talk about the non-Virginian president in the early years with you all at some point.
That sounds great, Lindsay. We look forward to that. So one of the participants notes that Washington displayed his reticence for power several occasions. To what degree is this something that is deeply held? And to what degree is it something that's calculated to, in fact, gain the very power that he's professing to be reluctant to exercise?
I'm really grateful for this question. Thank you for asking. And I like the way that you phrase it, because you are correct, I think, in alluding to the expectation at the time that politicians do not want to serve, that officials do not want power, and they have to be called to it. They have to be, sort of summoned by the people and are supposed to be reticent. And I think that it depends really when we're looking at Washington's life. There's no doubt he wanted to be commander-in-chief of the Continental Army. He showed up at Congress in military uniform. That was not a subtle hint, and was very intentional. And he was not serving in the military at that point, so he could have shown up in a suit. And instead, he just wanted to remind everyone he has a very nice fitting uniform and would be happy to serve. Later on, I do think it's more sincere. And partly that's for a few reasons. The men in Washington's family tended to die young, so he was convinced that he was going to die at any moment for like 2 decades. His reputation was so glorious that it could only really go down. And so he worried that if he kept coming back to power, he only really had one direction that he could go. And finally, when he gets to the presidency, especially in the second term, he knows how hard it is. He knows all of the potential pitfalls, and he is criticized really sort of viciously for the first time, I think, in his life. And he doesn't want to do that, and is convinced to serve for a second term because basically everyone on both sides says there's no one else. But I think it's genuine that he doesn't actually really want to do it. And so when it comes time for the third term, there's no convincing him to stay.
Question about what was the nature of Washington's relationship with Jefferson during his presidency?
So there was a great deal of respect. They weren't as close as some of the other people in Washington's cabinet because they hadn't served in the military together, and they hadn't had this sort of close personal relationship. But they had corresponded together during the war when Jefferson was governor and Washington was commander-in-chief. They had served together in the Second Continental Congress. And I think that they certainly respected one another. And Washington desperately wanted Jefferson to stay in the cabinet because he valued his input. He valued what he brought to the administration, and he valued that he had a different perspective than that of Alexander Hamilton. Washington wanted people around him that disagreed with each other because it would give him more options to choose from, and he felt like he could make a better choice, make better decisions. So Jefferson started talking about retiring as early as like late 1791 when he's barely in office, and Washington gets him to stay in office until December 1793. So he does so with flattery and outright begging, and I mean, everything, guilt trips, you name it, he tries it to get Jefferson to stay. But it wasn't the type of relationship that I think the close personal relationship that he had with some of the others.
What about John Adams? To what degree did Washington include Adams in policy making in his administration?
Almost not at all. So very early on in Washington's presidency, he did write a series of letters to people like Alexander Hamilton and John Jay and John Adams, asking for input, especially on that social etiquette question of, can the president accept a private invitation to dinner? Can the president host events? And he included Adams in that deliberation process to try and get his input. Very quickly, that ended. And I think partly it's because of Adams' role in what's called the title controversy, which was the first summer of that Congress was in session. They had to figure out what to call the president. And Adams thought that a fancier title would be beneficial because it would give prestige and respect to the office, keeping in mind, of course, that he had been to places like Versailles and the court of St. James, and he was worried that foreign dignitaries would not have respect for the president. So he wanted something totally ridiculous, which was like His Highness, an elected magistrate and protector of our liberties. I'm butchering it a little bit, but you get the gist. That didn't go over very well and was very unpopular. And ultimately, of course, we settled on Mr. President, which Washington supported. And I think that caused him to distrust Adams' political judgment. And so Adams was not invited to a single cabinet meeting. He was not included in policy decisions. They did socialize a lot, but they never had deep conversations until late 1796, when it was clear that Washington was going to retire and Adams was probably going to be president. And then he writes a letter to Abigail saying, like, basically, we've had the first real chat that we've had in decades.
So how did Adams feel about being frozen out?
Adams hated it. Adams said that the vice presidency was the most worthless office in human creation. He was certainly the first, but not the last vice president to feel that way. And I think to this day, the vice president is the worst job in DC because your only job is to have a pulse. And yet you're visible, and yet you're supposed to have responsibility. It's an impossible situation. So he hated not having anything to do. He desperately wanted to participate in the debates in the Senate, and the Senate basically told him to shut his mouth. And he desperately wanted responsibility, and he desperately wanted to be active because he had a very active mind and liked doing things. And so it drove him crazy that he wasn't involved in anything.
So to what degree is the difficulty of the job of being vice president a function of the constitutional design versus the precedent that Washington has set?
That's a great question. I do think it's some of both. I think it's mostly the constitutional design because the vice president doesn't have anything to do, but the presidency has become such a huge job that it's impossible for one person to do it. So it has become, over a period of time, something that a lot of presidents have relied on their vice presidents to take some of the duties off their plate, to serve sort of as a number two or an assistant. But that really didn't happen until Walter Mondale. He was the first vice president to actually have anything to do, to have any real responsibility. So it's a very modern creation. And so, Washington freezing John Adams out set the precedent for the next 170 years. But it's certainly, I think the ultimate is because of the Constitution.
Washington gave a very celebrated and eloquent farewell address, but this has not been standard for subsequent presidents. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think the farewell address is perhaps one of the most prescient political documents in American history. If you read it today, it warns against a couple of things. It warns against allowing our partisan differences to come between us. And Washington urges Northerners and Southerners and, those from the East and the West and Republicans and Federalists to remember that they have more in common with each other than they do different. And that is a message that we have to learn again and again and again, generation after generation, in American history. It also is incredibly wise when it comes to the importance of American place in the world, and a reminder that we should not allow foreign connections to interfere with our connections with each other. And so I think it's unique because no president really ever had the position Washington did, which is to say, I'm not going to run, but I could. And it is also something that I think should still continue to be taught and celebrated because of its very keen sense of the things that are going to divide us and continue to divide us and probably will divide us in the future.
Yeah. Could you say something more about George Washington's attitudes toward Native Americans?
So this is a place where Washington also showed an ability to evolve and to learn over time. I think as a very young man, he was fairly contemptuous. And yet, as he traveled across what he would call the West at the time, and then witnessed their incredible capacity for military success in his earlier military career, he had a grudging respect for their ability to fight back against a British army or a French army, and understood the complex relationship between the West and land and natives in a way that some others didn't necessarily. So he certainly didn't necessarily think that they were equal. Like we shouldn't put racial equality on Washington, but he wanted to treat with them as, I think, respectfully as any at that time did, and understood that white settlers were provoking violence by seizing native land, and yet also felt that the West and native land was essential to American expansion. So was trying to find a middle ground between respecting and preserving the land that he had sort of carved out for native nations to live on as their own and treat with them, while also not cramping Western expansion of American settlers. And that was, of course, an impossible task because it required the seizure of land that natives had held as important to their communities for decades, if not centuries, if not millennia, and did lead to a series of wars, including the first real sort of battle under the new United States, which the army was led by he was called Mad Anthony Wayne. I should not call him that, General Wayne. So it was certainly a part of the early years and the first term of Washington's presidency. It was a real pressing issue and something that he and Knox spent a great deal of time on.
Well, thank you, Lindsay, and I want to congratulate you. Your voice has held up just wonderfully well.
Thank you, and I apologize to everyone again about Quincy. What can you do with hounds? They just are infuriating.
That's all right. It added to the ambiance. So we are done, and I want to turn it back over to Althea, who will wrap up for us. So thank you again, Lindsay.
Thank you.
Thank you, Lindsay, and thank you, Alan, for moderating that wonderful, engaging conversation. That was really good. Lindsay, the audience learned so much from you today about George Washington's presidency and how this role as the president was formed and then has evolved over the years. So thank you. Thanks for being with us today. Today's lecture was recorded and will be available in Lifetime Learning's podcast library in about a week after the entire program concludes. We look forward to hearing from John Ragasta on Thomas Jefferson's presidency at 3 p.m. today. Please join us. Visit the Lifetime Learning's website for future programs at engagement.virginia.edu/learn. Have a nice lunch, and we look forward to seeing you at 3 p.m. for the next Spring Symposium lecture. Have a great day.